want to take two cases of market failure and contrast them with what public choice will consider to be the equivalent government failure. One of the arguments you often get raised in favor of government intervention is market failure arguments associated with the existence of externalities or collective goods. This is the idea that there are certain market transactions where the costs of the transaction aren't only felt by the parties to the transaction, that there are third parties who aren't involved in the transaction which can be affected nonetheless by the transaction. Classic cases of negative external effects would be things like air pollution. You've got a factory that's pumping out noxious fumes into the atmosphere when it's producing automobiles, but when it sells the automobiles to consumers, the costs to the consumers don't factor in the fact that these fumes are being pumped out into the atmosphere, polluting people's lungs, dirtying their washing lines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the argument is if we don't have government intervention, we'll get too many of these negative external effects. Externalities can also be positive. You can have situations where people receive benefits even though they've not actually paid a price for the benefits concerned. A very trivial example would be something like a rose garden. Somebody may plant a beautiful rose garden, passers by in the street, consume the benefits of the rose garden, they breathe in the scent, they look at the beautiful flowers, but they haven't actually paid a price for the provision of the roses. Now, in most situations like that, people would argue that there's no case for intervention because it's a relatively trivial positive externality. But in extreme cases of these positive external effects, what are known as collective goods situations, the argument is that there will be various important goods that people value, but that because of the character of these goods, the market won't produce them in sufficient quantities. A good example might be something like scenic views. It's going to be difficult for a farmer who maintains, say, traditional farming methods to exclude people from consuming the benefits of the view, even if they don't actually pay a price for the provision of the view. In this kind of a situation, a profit-oriented farmer isn't going to supply the environmental collective good of a scenic view in the optimum quantity, unless you get some kind of government action. Okay, now how would public choice analyze these type of scenarios? It would claim that, yes, collective goods problems or externality problems do lead to instances of market failure. Markets are imperfect. However, it would challenge the assumption that somehow by having government intervention, that these kind of externality and collective good dynamics somehow disappear, that the public sector is immune in some sense from the dynamics which lead to externalities and collective goods in markets. On a public choice view, the problems of externalities and collective goods don't disappear when we look at the way the political process operates. On the contrary, they're actually replicated within the structures of the political process itself. Let's take the argument of collective goods. Most people in democracies campaign for policies which they believe are going to benefit themselves or the members of the particular group that they've joined to campaign for the relevant policy. However, most public policies in a democratic context have collective goods attributes to them. You can gain the benefit of a public policy even if you haven't joined an interest group, participated in an interest group, which is campaigning for the relevant policy. So let's say, for example, you have an interest group which wants to form, which is the value for money for taxpayers interest group. If you're a taxpayer and you don't choose to join this particular interest group, you will get the benefits of better value for money for taxpayers, irrespective of whether you join the interest group or not, because it's going to be a non-excludable collective good. In this scenario, if you apply mainstream economic thinking, you would expect that the collective good of people mobilizing to supply value for money for taxpayers will be underproduced. The group simply won't get off the ground because the optimum strategy for people who could join the group is to free ride, to hope that other people will campaign in this way, and you just sit at home watching TV and cash in on the benefits later on at some point in time. It's a collective good problem replicated within the political process. Now, from a public choice point of view, all interest groups face these kind of collective good problems. However, certain types of groups find it easier to overcome the collective action problem, the collective good problem, than do others. Other things being equal, the smaller the interest group, the smaller the potential membership of the group, the more likely it is that the group will be able to overcome the collective action problem. Why? Because in a smaller situation, it's easier to monitor whether or not people are actually being free riders and to try to introduce some kind of mechanisms to encourage them to join the collective enterprise. Prediction that we get from public choice here. Relatively small groups which are campaigning for collective goods which will be concentrated on a relatively small number of people will find it easier to organize politically than much larger groups. A classic example of this will be the farming lobby in the UK and in the European Union. The European Union, out of the European Union's budget, something like 60% of it is spent on the Common Agricultural Policy, even though less than 2% of the EU population are farmers. Why does this scenario prevail? From a public choice perspective, it prevails because the farming lobby is much easier to organize politically than are the taxpayers and consumers who actually pay the costs of the policy. They face a larger collective goods or collective action problem in organizing than do the farmers. As a consequence, the farming lobby is able to impose negative externalities on the general population at large. We have a government failure generated by structural incentives within the political process. Second example of public choice analysis, the problem of asymmetric information. Many economists will argue for government regulation in markets where consumers are not well informed about the quality of the products that are up for sale. The argument is, in a market where people are well informed, competition will tend to drive up product standards because consumers can reward those producers who are supplying better value for money products. However, if you're in a market where consumers are not very well informed about the quality of the goods that are being supplied, there's no reason, argue mainstream economists, to believe that competition will drive up product standards at all. Because if consumers can't tell the difference between a good product and a poor product, there's no incentives for producers with high quality products to bring them onto the market because they're not going to be able to charge a higher price for those products. In this kind of a scenario, without government regulation, the argument is, poor quality products will drive out the will drive out the good. Competition can actually lead to a decline in product standards rather to some kind of improvement in them. What's the public choice view of this? Yes, asymmetric information problems do exist in some markets. They do lead to instances of market failure. But we can't assume that the process of regulation, which is supposed to be correcting for these market failures, will somehow be immune from the very same problems. From a public choice point of view, the problem of asymmetric information is also reflected in the way the political process operates. In politics, politicians supply public policies to the electorate. But if we're going to get good quality public policies, policies which correct for market failures, as opposed to making those failures worse or even introducing failures which previously didn't exist, then the voters have got to be well informed about what politicians are actually doing in their name. But from a public choice point of view, actually, voters in most democracies are very poorly informed. They don't have good access to information about the quality of the public policies that politicians are supplying. They can't tell the difference between a good policy and a bad policy. Therefore, competition in the democratic process, far from leading to an improvement in the quality of regulation, actually leads to a decline in the quality of the regulation.